The morning sun was just beginning to rise over the small town of Ridgeville, painting the streets in soft gold. The town wasn't big, just one of those quiet American places where everyone seemed to know everyone. On the corner of Main Street stood a restaurant called Harvest Table, a cozy spot known for its homemade food and friendly atmosphere. The owner, Mr. David Collins, had built it from the ground up nearly 15 years ago. He wasn't the kind of man who liked attention. He was calm, thoughtful, and had a way of noticing things other people missed. His restaurant had grown popular over the years. Families came for Sunday brunch, couples for anniversaries, and students for an affordable bite after school. But as it grew, something began to bother David. He started to hear small complaints, nothing major, just murmurs. A customer once said a waiter had ignored them for too long. Another mentioned that a young boy felt uncomfortable because he wasn't treated like the other customers. David didn't want to believe it, but he also knew human nature. Sometimes people changed when no one was watching. So one Thursday morning, David decided to do something he had never done before. He wanted to see what really happened. In his restaurant, when his staff didn't know the boss was around, he stood in front of the mirror in his small apartment, above the restaurant, wearing old jeans, a faded hoodie, and a baseball cap. He even put on a pair of glasses with clear lenses he didn't need. When he looked at himself, he hardly recognized the man in the mirror. He smiled a little. "Guess I look like any regular guy now," he muttered. He waited until the lunch rush began. It was the busiest time, when the kitchen clanged with pots and pans and servers rushed between tables with plates of steaming food. He walked down the stairs, blending into the crowd of customers entering the restaurant. No one looked twice at him. The restaurant smelled like baked bread and roasted chicken. The hum of chatter filled the air, laughter from one corner, the clinking of cutlery in another. The walls were decorated with old photographs from around town. Farmers, school teams, parades. It gave the place a warm hometown feel. David found a quiet corner near the window and took a seat. He wanted to see everything. The way his staff greeted guests, the way customers were treated, the small things that told the truth about a business. A young waitress walked up to him with a polite smile. "Good afternoon. Table for one?" "Yes, thank you," David said softly. "Can I get you started with something to drink?" "Just water, please." She nodded, still smiling, and walked away. David watched her move between tables, cheerful, kind, no sign of impatience. It gave him hope. But as he looked around, he noticed something that caught his attention. The door opened again, and two boys stepped inside. They looked to be around 15 or 16. Their clothes were clean but worn. One had a jacket that seemed a size too big. The other's sneakers looked old but carefully washed. They paused near the entrance, looking around nervously as if they weren't sure they belonged there. David could see the way they whispered to each other before taking hesitant steps toward the host stand. The hostess, a young woman with a ponytail, greeted them with a polite but slightly uncertain smile. "Hi there, just the two of you?" "Yes, ma'am," one of the boys said quickly. His voice was soft, respectful. "All right, right this way," she said, grabbing two menus. As they followed her, David noticed something small. The boys' eyes flicked around the room, not in curiosity, but as if they were checking if anyone was watching them. He had seen that kind of look before, the look of someone used to being judged before they even spoke. The hostess seated them a few tables away from David. They sat down quietly, whispering again. David opened his menu and pretended to read, but his attention stayed on the two boys. He didn't know why, but something about them stirred a strange feeling, part curiosity, part concern. A different waitress walked over to their table. Her name was Ellen, one of his more experienced staff. Normally she was friendly and confident, but David noticed a change in her face as she approached the boys. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Hi there," she said. "Can I get you something to drink?" Just water for now," one boy replied. "Sure thing," Ellen said. Her tone was polite but distant. She left without much warmth. David frowned slightly. He wasn't sure if he was imagining it or if something really was off. He knew Ellen well, she was a good worker, but right now she seemed uncomfortable. The boys opened their menus carefully, whispering again. David could only catch small bits of their conversation. "Man, it smells so good in here." "Yeah, I can't believe we finally made it. I told you it was worth saving up for." Those words made David's chest tighten a little. Saving up? He watched them glance down the menu, hesitating before pointing at one or two cheaper dishes. One boy smiled nervously and said, "Maybe we can split something." Ellen returned with their water. "Ready to order?" she asked quickly. The boys nodded. "Can we get one grilled chicken plate?" "We'll share it." Ellen raised an eyebrow for just a second. It wasn't rude, just a flicker, but David saw it. The kind of tiny reaction that said more than words. She wrote down the order and walked away. David sighed quietly. He didn't want to jump to conclusions, but he felt a knot forming in his stomach. He thought about the stories he'd heard, about kids being treated differently just because they looked like they didn't belong in certain places. He didn't want that happening under his roof. He looked out the window for a moment, watching cars pass by, then turned his gaze back to the boys. They were talking again, smiling now, getting more comfortable. One boy was telling the other about his mother, how she always said good things about the restaurant. "She said the owner's a nice guy, real fair," the boy said. "Said he started this place from nothing." The other boy nodded. "Yeah, my uncle said that too. He said the food's honest and like made with heart, you know?" David felt a strange warmth in his chest hearing that. They didn't know who he was, but somehow they already respected him. That meant something. As they waited for their food, they watched the waiters move around, the clatter of plates, the smell of food in the air. Every once in a while, one of them would glance around the room, taking everything in with quiet curiosity. The laughter, the families, the groups of friends. David could tell they were soaking it all in. Maybe it was their first time eating somewhere like this. Maybe it meant more than anyone else realized. When their food finally arrived, Ellen placed the plate between them with a small smile. "Here you go, enjoy." "Thank you, ma'am," one of the boys said politely. They didn't dig in right away. Instead, they took a moment, almost like they were grateful for just being there. Then they started to share the food, one cutting pieces carefully so they could both have enough. David kept pretending to read his menu, but his heart was already somewhere else. He was thinking about what it meant for two young kids to save their money just to come to a restaurant like his. He thought about how much courage it took to walk in, sit down, and act like they belonged when the world sometimes made people feel they didn't. He thought about his own childhood, growing up poor, wearing hand-me-downs, eating whatever his mother could afford. He knew that feeling too well. Then he heard something that made him pause. One of the boys said softly, "When I get older, I want to have a place like this. You know, a restaurant where everybody feels like they're somebody, where no one gets weird looks." The other boy smiled. "You'd be good at that, man." "Nah," he said with a shy laugh. "I don't even know where to start." David felt something stir deep inside. He thought about the dream he once had, when he was just a young man washing dishes at someone else's diner. He remembered telling himself that someday he'd open a place where people felt welcome no matter who they were. And now, here he was, hearing the same dream from someone half his age. It hit him hard. For a while, David just sat there quietly, listening to the sounds of the restaurant, the laughter, the chatter, the faint music playing from the speakers. He wondered if the boys could tell how proud he felt just hearing their words. They ate slowly, taking small bites, clearly trying to make the meal last. Every so often, one would say something that made the other laugh quietly. It wasn't the loud laughter of kids showing off. It was soft, real, grateful. When they finished eating, Ellen came back to clear the table. "Would you like the check?" she asked. "Yes, please," one of them said. As she walked away, David noticed them checking their wallets, carefully counting small bills and coins. They whispered to each other, probably making sure they had enough. It made him smile, but it also broke his heart a little. He thought, they saved up for this. Just for one meal, he didn't move yet. He just sat there watching, thinking, feeling more human than he had in a long time. For years, he had focused on running the business, numbers, schedules, staff, suppliers. But at that moment, he remembered why he started it in the first place. It wasn't just to make money. It was to create something that made people feel valued. He took a deep breath, knowing what he was going to do next. Before Ellen could bring the check, David stood up from his seat. He walked toward the counter, keeping his hat low. "Hey," he said quietly to the cashier, "put that table's meal on my bill." The cashier nodded, not recognizing him. Sure thing, sir. David returned to his seat just as the boys received their check. When they opened it and saw the total marked as paid, they looked confused. What? Did we already pay? One asked. The other shook his head. No, I didn't give them any money yet. They waved Ellen over. Excuse me, ma'am. It says we already paid, but we didn't. Ellen checked the slip, frowning slightly. Oh, looks like someone took care of it for you. Who? One of the boys asked. She shrugged. I'm not sure. The boys looked around the restaurant, puzzled. David sat quietly, pretending to sip his water. After a moment, one of the boys smiled faintly and said, Guess there are still good people out there. David smiled behind his cup. He didn't say anything. Not yet. He watched them stand up, thank the waitress again, and head toward the door. Just before they left, one turned around and looked back at the restaurant. For a brief second, his eyes met David's, though he didn't recognize him. There was something pure in that look. Gratitude. Hope. David's heart felt full. He knew this wasn't just another day at the restaurant. Something had shifted inside him. He didn't know exactly where this story was headed, but he could feel it. This was only the beginning. The next morning, the smell of coffee filled the air inside the restaurant as sunlight poured through the front windows. It was still early before the lunch rush began. David sat alone at one of the tables, staring at the same seat where the two boys had sat the day before. He couldn't stop thinking about them. He had spent most of the night awake, replaying their words in his mind, the quiet tone of hope in their voices, the way they looked around like they were stepping into a different world. They had come in with nothing but good hearts and small dreams, and yet something about how they were treated still bothered him. He had built Harvest Table on the idea of kindness, on the belief that people should always be treated with respect, no matter who they were or where they came from. But what he saw yesterday reminded him that sometimes good places still had blind spots. David took a sip of his coffee and sighed. He had seen it before, not open rudeness, but small things that chipped away at a person's dignity, a tone, a look, a tiny pause before a smile, things that most people never noticed, but that could make someone feel like they didn't belong. He didn't want his restaurant to be that kind of place. Just then, the front door opened and his manager, Claire, walked in, carrying her notebook and a box of pastries. "Morning, boss," she said with her usual cheerful smile. "Morning," David said, trying to sound casual. She poured herself some coffee and sat across from him. "You're here early again. Something on your mind?" David hesitated. "I came in yesterday." Unannounced, her eyebrows lifted. "Oh, like as a customer?" He nodded slowly. "I wanted to see how things really run when I'm not standing behind the counter." Claire chuckled softly. "I bet that was interesting." "It was," he said quietly. "I saw a lot of good things. The staff worked hard. Customers seemed happy. But there was something that didn't sit right." Claire frowned a little. "What happened?" "Two young boys came in," he said, leaning back in his chair. They looked a little nervous, maybe their first time here. They were polite, quiet, respectful. But I noticed how some people looked at them, including one of our waitresses." Claire blinked. "Who?" "I don't want to point fingers," he said gently. "It wasn't anything big. Just small things." A change in tone. "Less warmth than usual." She nodded slowly. "Sometimes people don't even realize they're doing it." "I know," David said. "But that's exactly why it matters. We have to notice." They sat in silence for a moment. The only sound was the low hum of the coffee machine. David looked out the window, remembering the boys' quiet laughter, their shy smiles, their small conversation about wanting to build something good someday. "I want to do something," he said finally. "Something that reminds everyone, staff and customers, that this place is about people, not just business." Claire smiled softly. "That sounds like you. Let's start with a staff meeting this weekend," he said. "But first I want to find those boys. I want to thank them. Do you know who they were?" He shook his head. "No, but maybe someone in town does." That afternoon, while the restaurant buzzed with customers, David took a walk around town. Ridgeville wasn't big, just a few main streets lined with small shops. A grocery store, a barber, and a school nearby. He stopped at the community center, where he often donated food for local events. Mrs. Wilson, the coordinator, was sitting behind her desk sorting flyers. "Afternoon." "David," she said warmly. "You look thoughtful." Everything all right? I'm looking for two boys, he said. Teenagers, maybe 15 or 16. They came into my restaurant yesterday. I just wanted to talk to them again. She smiled. What did they do, eat too much pie? He chuckled. No, they did something better. They reminded me what kindness looks like. Mrs. Wilson looked curious. I might know who you mean. There's a pair of friends who help out here after school sometimes. They're good kids. I think they go to Ridgeville High. Do you know when they'll be around next? They usually stop by on Fridays to help stack boxes. David smiled. Thanks, Mrs. Wilson, I'll come by then. As he walked back toward the restaurant, he felt something lift inside him, a quiet sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. The next 2 days passed quickly. The restaurant stayed busy, and David worked alongside his team like usual. But in his mind, he kept going back to that table, to the boys' voices, and to the way their eyes lit up when they talked about their dreams. On Friday afternoon, he left the restaurant a bit early and walked to the community center. The air smelled like rain, and gray clouds were gathering above. Inside, he heard the sound of laughter and boxes being shuffled. 2 boys were at the far end of the room, stacking cans on a shelf. David recognized them immediately, the same 2 from Harvest Table. He smiled and walked over slowly. Hey there, he said kindly. They turned around, surprised. For a second, they didn't seem to recognize him without his hat and glasses. Remember me? David asked with a grin. One of the boys squinted. Wait, you were in the restaurant? That's right, David said. You 2 sat near me. Their eyes widened. You were the guy with the hat. You paid for our meal, didn't you? David nodded gently. I did. They both looked shocked, then one of them smiled shyly. You didn't have to do that, sir. We were okay. I know, David said, but I wanted to. He paused, then added, You said something in there that really stuck with me. They looked curious. You said you wanted to build a place where everyone feels welcome, he said softly. That's what I wanted when I started Harvest Table too. Hearing you say that reminded me why I began. The boys exchanged a glance and one said quietly, It's just something I've been thinking about. My mom says people remember how you make them feel, not what you give them. That's wise advice, David said, smiling, and she's right. He looked around the community center. Shelves of donated goods, kids packing bags, volunteers chatting. It was simple but full of heart. You know, he said, if you ever want to learn how a restaurant works, you can come by Harvest Table anytime. I'll show you what goes on behind the scenes. Their eyes lit up. Really? Really, he said. No promises of fancy jobs, but you'll learn things. Maybe even get a free lunch once in a while. They laughed, clearly excited. Thank you, sir, one said. That means a lot. David nodded and shook their hands. I'll see you both soon, then. As he left the community center, a soft rain began to fall. He pulled up his collar and walked home with a small smile on his face. For the first time in a long while, he felt like something meaningful was beginning. By Saturday morning, the restaurant was busy again. David gathered his staff before opening for their regular meeting. Everyone stood in a small circle, cooks in aprons, waiters with notepads, the hostess with her hair tied back. All right, everyone, David began. I wanted to talk about something important. He paused, looking around the room. You all know this restaurant was built on kindness. Not just good food, not just good service, on kindness. Real kindness, the staff nodded quietly. Yesterday I met 2 young boys, he continued. They came here earlier this week. They were polite, humble, and full of dreams. But I saw something that bothered me. Not from everyone, but from us as a group. They didn't feel fully welcome here. A few people shifted uncomfortably. I'm not saying anyone meant harm, he said gently. Sometimes we don't even realize how small things, our tone, our expressions, can make someone feel less than they are. The room stayed silent. I want us to be better, David said. We're not just serving food. We're serving moments, the kind of moments people carry with them long after they leave. Claire spoke up softly. Maybe we could do something as a team. Like a community night? David smiled. Exactly. I was thinking of something like that. Maybe a monthly dinner where kids from town can come learn about food, cooking, or even running a business. We could start small. The staff began to nod, their tension easing. Some even smiled, clearly inspired by the idea. Ellen, the waitress from that day, raised her hand quietly. "Mr. Collins," she said, "I think I know which boys you mean. I served them, and I think you're right. I didn't mean to make them uncomfortable, but I might have." David met her eyes and smiled kindly. "That's all right, Ellen. What matters is what we do now." She nodded, relief washing over her face. By the end of the meeting, the mood had changed completely. The staff weren't defensive anymore. They were motivated. A few days later, the boys came by after school, wearing their backpacks and curious smiles. David was behind the counter when they walked in. "Welcome back," he said warmly. "Right on time." They laughed shyly. "We didn't want to be late." He led them into the kitchen where the cooks were preparing ingredients for dinner. The boys' eyes went wide at the sight. The sizzling pans, the smell of garlic and onions, the rhythm of teamwork. "This is where the magic happens," David said. "Everyone here has a job. The kitchen's like a family. You respect each other, you work together, and you learn something new every day." The boys nodded, watching with fascination. He handed them aprons and gloves. "You can start by helping with simple stuff. Washing vegetables, handing things to the cooks. Watch how they move. Notice how they talk to each other." They got to work eagerly. The rest of the day passed in laughter and learning. The cook showed them small tricks: how to slice an onion safely, how to season food just right, how to keep the kitchen clean. By the end of the shift, both boys were sweaty but smiling from ear to ear. "You did great," David said, clapping one on the shoulder. "Come back next week and I'll teach you how to plate food like a pro." They grinned. "We will." As they left, David stood by the door watching them run down the street with that same spark he'd seen before. He felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Pure hope. Sometimes, he thought, all it took was listening. One quiet afternoon, one small conversation, one act of kindness. What started as a simple visit in disguise had now turned into something far bigger. A reminder that the world could always use more people willing to care, even in the smallest ways. David turned off the lights and locked up for the night, feeling at peace. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure. Harvest Table had just found its heart again, and it started with 2 boys, a dream, and a meal that meant more than anyone could have guessed. The next few weeks at Harvest Table felt different. There was a quiet energy in the air, the kind that comes when people start caring a little more about what they do. The staff seemed lighter, kinder, more thoughtful. Even the customers noticed it. David saw it every day. The way the servers smiled a little warmer, the way the cooks joked in the kitchen while still working hard, the way the regulars lingered longer after their meals. But what warmed his heart the most was seeing the 2 boys show up after school almost every afternoon. They came with eager faces and a sense of pride that David recognized. The pride of learning something new and feeling like you belong somewhere. They weren't just visitors anymore. They were part of the place now. Every day they helped in small ways, peeling potatoes, cleaning tables, or watching the chefs as they prepared meals. And slowly they started to pick up the rhythm of restaurant life. One of the cooks, a big man with a booming laugh, showed them how to make the restaurant's famous cornbread. Another taught them how to fold napkins neatly, saying, "Presentation matters as much as flavor." The boys listened carefully, never complaining, never wasting time. David often stood by the kitchen doorway, watching them quietly, a proud smile playing on his lips. One evening, after the rush hour ended, David called them over. "You 2 have been doing great," he said. "I think you've earned your first small job here." Their eyes widened in surprise. "Really?" He nodded. "Starting next week, you can help with the evening prep shift. 2 hours a day after school. It's not much, but you'll learn a lot." The boys looked at each other, grinning. "We'll do our best, sir." "I know you will," David said with a warm smile. As they left that evening, he felt something deep in his chest. Not pride in himself, but gratitude. Gratitude that life had brought them into his restaurant and reminded him what mattered most. A few days later, David received a call from the local high school principal. "Mr. Collins, I heard you've taken a couple of our students under your wing," she said kindly. "They've been talking about how much they're learning at your restaurant." David chuckled. "They're good kids, hard workers. They've got a spark that's rare these days." The principal smiled through the phone. "They do, and I wanted to say thank you. You've given them something more valuable than a job. You've given them belief. That sentence stayed with David long after the call ended. He sat at his office desk, staring at the wall where he kept old photos from when he first opened Harvest Table. There was one picture of him and his late father, standing proudly beside the newly painted sign, smiling like they had conquered the world. His father had once told him, "The day you forget that people come before profit, you've lost what matters." For years, David thought he understood that, but lately he felt like he was only now truly learning it again. The restaurant's community night, the one he had planned with the staff, came sooner than expected. Flyers went up around town. The message was simple: free dinner and dream talk, for every teen with a dream to build something good. At first, David didn't know if anyone would show up. But on the evening of the event, the restaurant filled quickly. There were kids from the local high school, parents from the neighborhood, and even some teachers. The air buzzed with laughter, chatter, and the smell of warm food. David and his staff moved from table to table, serving plates, greeting guests, and making sure everyone felt welcome. When the time came for him to speak, he stood at the center of the room, holding a microphone with a humble smile. "Good evening, everyone," he began. "Some of you know me and some of you don't. My name's David Collins, and I started this place 15 years ago with nothing but a dream, the same kind of dream I've heard many of you talk about tonight." The room went quiet, listening. "I didn't come from much," he continued. "I was raised by a hardworking mother and a father who taught me that kindness matters more than money. When I started this restaurant, I wanted it to be a place where people felt seen, where no one had to wonder if they belonged." He looked toward the two boys sitting near the front. "But a few weeks ago I realized I had stopped noticing. I let things slip without meaning to, and it took two young men walking through that door to remind me what I was missing." The room stayed silent, not the uncomfortable kind, but the kind filled with heart. "So tonight," he said, "I want this to be more than dinner. I want this to be the start of something new, a space where young people with big dreams can come and learn, ask questions, and feel encouraged, no matter who they are." When he finished, the room broke into soft applause. Some smiled, others nodded, and a few even wiped their eyes. The boys looked at each other amazed. They hadn't known how much that one meal had changed everything. After the event, people came up to thank David, offering to help with future programs or donate supplies. Teachers volunteered to mentor, and local businesses offered to share their experience. By the end of the night, Harvest Table had become more than a restaurant. It had become a gathering place for hope. Over the next month, the restaurant's youth night became a regular thing. Every Friday, teens from the community would come by to help in the kitchen, learn about food, and listen to small talks about business, kindness, and life. The two boys became mentors themselves, showing newcomers how to chop vegetables, clean tables, and treat guests with respect. David watched them proudly as they guided others, remembering how shy they had been when they first walked in. Now they carried themselves with quiet confidence. One Friday evening, after everyone had gone home, David sat with them at a table near the window. The lights were low and the smell of fresh bread still hung in the air. "You two have come a long way," he said. "You should be proud." They smiled, a little embarrassed. "We just did what you taught us." David shook his head gently. "No, you reminded me what I had forgotten. You taught me too." They laughed softly, and one of them said, "Maybe we all learned something." David leaned back, his eyes soft with emotion. "You know what I think? I think you're going to do big things. And when you do, don't forget this feeling, the one you get when you make people happy. That's what will keep you grounded." They nodded, thoughtful. As they left that night, David felt a calm sense of fulfillment. Life had come full circle in the most unexpected way. One evening, a few weeks later, something surprising happened. A journalist from the local newspaper came by to eat. She noticed the warm energy in the restaurant, the laughter, the students helping, the atmosphere of belonging. After dinner, she asked to speak with David. "I've been hearing stories about what you're doing here," she said, "about how you're giving kids a chance to learn and grow. I think people would love to hear about it." David hesitated. He wasn't the kind of man who liked attention, but this wasn't really about him. It was about the boys, the community, and the message behind it. "All right," he said finally, "as long as it focuses on them, not me." The next week, the article came out with the headline, A restaurant serving more than food. Harvest Table teaches kindness and dreaming big. The story spread quickly around town. More people began visiting, not just to eat, but to be part of something meaningful. Parents brought their kids to volunteer. Schools asked to collaborate. And other restaurants even reached out to ask how they could start similar programs. David couldn't believe how far a single act of kindness had gone. One afternoon, as he was restocking the pantry, he found the boys sitting at the counter, looking at the newspaper clipping framed on the wall. "That's crazy," one of them said. "Who would have thought we'd end up in the paper?" David smiled. "You earned it," the boy shook his head. "We just came in for lunch one day." "Sometimes," David said softly, "that's all it takes. One moment. One small choice." They nodded, thoughtful. Then one of them asked quietly, "Do you ever think about how different things would be if we hadn't come in that day?" David paused. "I do. And I think about how lucky I am that you did." Spring came around, and with it the restaurant's anniversary. 15 years since the day David first opened its doors. He decided to celebrate it not with a fancy event, but with a simple community dinner, free for everyone. The town showed up in full. Families, students, teachers, and even some of the staff who had worked with him years ago. The two boys helped serve food, wearing clean white aprons and big smiles. Halfway through the evening, David stood up to speak again. He looked around the packed room, faces glowing with warmth, laughter bouncing off the walls, and felt his heart swell with gratitude. "I've run this place for 15 years, he said. "And in that time I've learned something I'll never forget. People make a place what it is. Not the walls, not the food, not the name, people." He looked toward the boys. "And sometimes the ones who change you most are the ones who don't even realize they're doing it." The room applauded softly. David felt a lump in his throat but smiled anyway. "Thank you, all of you, for reminding me what this restaurant was always meant to be." When the dinner ended, he stood outside watching families walk home under the streetlights. The boys stood beside him, quiet and content. The night air was cool and gentle, carrying the soft sounds of laughter down the street. David turned to them. "You know, I think your dream is already coming true." They looked puzzled. "How?" he smiled. "You said you wanted a place where everyone feels welcome. Look around." They followed his gaze. People hugging, kids waving goodbye, strangers smiling at one another like old friends. The boys smiled too. "Maybe you're right," David chuckled. "No, maybe about it." They stood there for a while longer, saying nothing, just watching the quiet joy around them. It had started with one meal, one act of kindness, one reminder of humanity. But now, it had grown into something that belonged to everyone. And in that moment, David realized something simple yet profound, and sometimes the smallest hearts carry the biggest lessons. The story that began with two boys walking into a restaurant had become a story about everyone walking into each other's lives with kindness. It wasn't just about food anymore. It was about community, about hope, about learning to see one another again. And as the lights inside Harvest Table dimmed for the night, David whispered to himself with a quiet smile, This is what it was all for." Life at Harvest Table slowly found its rhythm again. The big community dinner had left everyone inspired. The air around the restaurant seemed lighter, like something had shifted for good. Every morning the sun poured through the wide front windows, filling the room with a calm glow. The smell of coffee brewing, the sound of laughter from the kitchen, the clatter of plates, all of it made the place feel alive in a way David hadn't felt in years. The two boys had now become a regular part of the team. They weren't just helping after school anymore. They were trusted assistants, learning everything from cooking to customer service. People loved them. Regular customers often asked about them. Some even came just to see how they were doing. One afternoon, while the boys were wiping down tables, a woman approached them with a bright smile. "You two have grown so much," she said warmly. "I've been coming here for months, and you're always so polite. You remind me of my sons when they were your age." The boys thanked her shyly, and David, who overheard from the counter, smiled quietly. Moments like that reminded him how powerful a little encouragement could be. Later that week, something unexpected happened. A letter arrived at the restaurant, a handwritten one, rare these days. It was addressed simply to the owner of Harvest Table. David opened it slowly. Inside, the handwriting was neat but humble. It read, "Dear Mr. Owner, I don't know you personally, but I've been following what you've done at your restaurant. I heard about the youth nights and the way you help kids. My daughter eats there sometimes and told me how kind everyone is. I just wanted to say thank you. The world needs more people like you. People who see others, not just customers. Please keep doing what you're doing. You're making a difference." There was no signature, just those few words. David read the note twice, then placed it on his desk carefully. For a long moment he sat still, his chest warm with quiet gratitude. He had received many compliments over the years, but this one felt different. It wasn't about the food or service. It was about meaning. He tucked the letter into a small wooden box he kept in his office, the same box that held his father's old pocket watch. Weeks passed, and business continued to grow steadily. But more than that, the restaurant had become a safe place for many. After school, kids would drop by just to talk, even if they didn't work there. Sometimes they sat in the back corner doing homework while the smell of fresh bread filled the air. One afternoon, David noticed one of the boys sitting quietly with another student, helping him with math homework. He didn't interrupt, just watched from a distance, smiling. It was strange to think that only months ago, those same boys had come in hungry and uncertain, wondering if they even belonged there. Now they were the ones creating space for others to belong. That night, after closing, David stood outside the restaurant. The streetlights glowed softly, and the cool wind carried the faint hum of the city. He thought about how life had changed, not through some big event, but through small acts that built up over time. Sometimes the world didn't need grand gestures. It just needed people willing to care. But life has a way of testing good things. One morning, while the staff prepared for the lunch rush, the power suddenly went out. The refrigerator stopped humming, the lights flickered off, and the air conditioning fell silent. Everyone froze. David quickly checked the breaker, but it wasn't a simple fix. The outage stretched across several blocks. The restaurant couldn't serve without power. No stoves, no lights, no card machines. The staff looked worried. "What do we do now?" someone asked. David thought for a moment, then said, "We make it work." They dragged tables closer to the windows for natural light. The boys ran outside to help carry in small portable fans from the storage shed. With the ovens off, the cooks began preparing sandwiches and salads, simple, fresh, and quick. When customers started arriving, David greeted each of them personally, explaining the situation with a smile. "Sorry about the menu today," he said cheerfully, "but I promise the sandwiches are made with love and in sunlight." People laughed, and instead of leaving, many chose to stay. The restaurant turned into a kind of picnic spot. The boys helped pass out cold drinks, chatting with customers as if everything was perfectly normal. For hours, they worked through the heat, handing out meals and smiles. By the end of the day, when the power finally returned, everyone was sweaty and tired, but happy. One of the servers looked around and said, "You know what, that was one of the best days we've had." David nodded. "Because we didn't let trouble stop us. We turned it into something good." The boys grinned proudly, wiping their foreheads. Moments like that reminded David how strong they'd all become. Not just as workers, but as people. One weekend, the boys came to David with an idea. "Sir, we were thinking," one of them began, "maybe we could start something small, like a little food stand outside the restaurant on Saturdays. We could sell sandwiches and lemonade to raise money for school supplies for kids who need them." David raised his eyebrows, impressed. "That's a wonderful idea." "Whose idea was it?" They smiled shyly. "We both thought of it after seeing some kids at school who couldn't afford things. We figured maybe we could help even a little." David felt a lump in his throat. "You don't just want to make food when you want to make a difference." They nodded. He smiled. "All right then, let's make it happen." That week, the restaurant staff worked together to set up a small booth outside, decorated with hand-painted signs. The boys made the sandwiches themselves. Simple, fresh, delicious. People loved it. Some came just to support the cause. Within 2 weekends, they had raised enough to buy backpacks and supplies for a dozen kids. The day they handed out the supplies, the boys couldn't stop smiling. One of them whispered to David, "This feels better than anything we've ever done." David nodded softly. That's because giving always feels better than receiving. A few days later, something happened that touched David deeply. One of the teachers from the local school came by during lunch. She approached David and said, "I just wanted to tell you something. Those two boys, and they've changed so much. Their grades are up, their confidence has grown, and they're talking about wanting to open their own restaurant one day." David smiled wide. "Really?" "Yes," she said. "They said they want to create a place where everyone feels welcome, just like here." For a moment, David couldn't speak. His throat tightened with emotion. When she left, he stood quietly near the counter, watching the two boys laughing in the kitchen. Realized he was witnessing something powerful. The beginning of a new generation carrying forward the same light his father once gave him. It wasn't just about teaching them how to cook or run a restaurant. It was about teaching them how to see people, really see them. Later that evening, after closing, David sat with the boys at the counter. The lights were dim and the sound of the city outside was faint. "I heard you two have dreams of opening your own place someday," he said with a smile. They laughed, embarrassed. "Maybe one day. We've learned a lot from you." David leaned forward. "If you ever do, promise me one thing, build it with heart. Don't just make food. Make people feel like they matter." They nodded seriously. "We promise," he smiled softly. That's all I could ask for. Summer came and the city felt alive with color and warmth. Harvest Table thrived, not because of fancy advertising or trends, but because of genuine connection. People who came there felt something they couldn't explain. Peace, kindness, belonging. One hot afternoon, a small group of travelers stopped by, drawn in by the smell of roasted chicken and baked bread. They didn't know the story behind the place. They just wanted a meal. But as they ate, they noticed the laughter, the way the staff helped one another, the boys greeting everyone with smiles. When they finished, one of them said to David, "I don't know what it is about this place, but it feels like home." David smiled quietly. "That's the best compliment we could ever get." As the months passed, the boys became young men. They finished high school and prepared to start college. Their last day working full-time at the restaurant was emotional. The staff threw them a small farewell dinner filled with laughter and stories. David gave them each a small envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter and a simple keychain shaped like a spoon. He said, "This isn't goodbye. It's just the next chapter. And this keychain, and it's a reminder. No matter where you go, no matter what you do, remember where you started. Remember that kindness can build anything." The boys hugged him tightly. One of them whispered, "We won't forget." "You changed our lives," David smiled through misty eyes. "You changed mine first." After they left for college, the restaurant felt a little quieter but not empty. Their energy still lingered in the walls, in the laughter of the staff, in the warmth of the customers. Sometimes, during a slow afternoon, David would look at the framed newspaper article on the wall. Next to a new photo, the boys on their last day, smiling in their white aprons. He often thought about how everything had started. Two boys talking over lunch. Words he was never meant to hear and a lesson he didn't know he needed. Now, the restaurant had become a legacy of those moments. Small, human and full of heart. One evening, long after closing, David stood by the window watching the sunset fade into soft orange light. He thought about his father, about the lessons he'd passed down, and about how those lessons had quietly traveled through time. From one heart to another, across generations, he whispered to himself, "Kindness doesn't end with us. It keeps going." Outside, the city lights blinked to life. Inside, the restaurant glowed softly, ready for another day, another story, another chance to remind someone that goodness still existed. And somewhere far away, two young men sat in their college dorm room, planning their first dream, a small cafe, where everyone would feel welcome no matter who they were. They smiled, remembering the man who believed in them first. The legacy of Harvest Table lived on, not through walls or recipes, but through the quiet, unstoppable power of human kindness. Time passed gently at Harvest Table. The seasons turned, the air grew colder, and the golden leaves that once danced along the sidewalks began to fall. The restaurant still thrived, but it carried a quieter rhythm now, the kind that comes with wisdom and age. David had gotten used to the slower days. He didn't rush anymore. He still opened the doors early each morning, letting the smell of fresh coffee fill the air. But he took his time to breathe, to look around, to appreciate what had become of his life's work. The framed photos on the walls told stories, smiling faces, community dinners, young people learning, laughter frozen in time. And right at the center hung the photo of the two boys in their aprons, their eyes full of hope, their smiles bright as sunlight. Sometimes customers asked about them. "Those young men in the photo, who are they?" David always smiled softly and said, "They're the reason this place became what it is." He never went into detail unless someone really wanted to listen. But when he did, he told the story slowly, letting each memory unfold like pages in a book. He talked about the day he overheard their conversation, how their words had changed his heart, how their courage reminded him what kindness looked like when the world wasn't watching. Every time he told it, people listened quietly. Some even teared up. And when he finished, they always said the same thing: "We need more stories like that." A year later, just as spring began to bloom again, David received a letter in the mail. He recognized the handwriting immediately. It was from the boys, or rather, the young men they had become. The letter was filled with warmth and excitement. They were doing well in college. One was studying business, the other culinary arts. And together, they were working on a plan, their dream cafe. They wrote, "We've been saving up, working part-time, and writing down every idea we can think of. We want it to be a place where people feel safe and seen, just like Harvest Table. You showed us what a real community looks like, and we want to carry that forward." At the bottom, they had written one more line: "When it's ready, we hope you'll be there for the opening, because it wouldn't exist without you." David sat in silence for a long time after reading the letter. His hands trembled slightly, not from age, but from emotion. He smiled to himself. "They did it," he whispered. That evening, he showed the letter to his staff. Everyone cheered and clapped, proud of the two young men who had once walked through those doors with nothing but hope. It was strange, David thought, how life could come full circle like that. How one small encounter could ripple through time, touching lives in ways no one could have predicted. Months passed, and summer returned. One quiet afternoon, David sat near the window, sipping coffee and reading the newspaper. The restaurant was calm, only a few customers here and there, soft music playing in the background. He glanced at the clock. It was nearing 3 when the door suddenly opened. Two familiar figures walked in, taller now, more grown up, but still carrying that same light in their eyes. "Look who it is," David said, standing up with a wide grin. They laughed and ran over, hugging him tightly. "We missed you." David laughed too, his eyes glistening. "You boys have grown. Look at you, all sharp and confident." They sat together, catching up like family. They told him about college, the sleepless nights, the new friends, the long hours at part-time jobs. But more than anything, they talked about their dream cafe. They had found a small space in a nearby town. Nothing fancy, just a cozy corner building with large windows and an open kitchen. "It's small," one of them said, "but it feels right." David listened with pride. That's how all good things start, small and full of heart. They smiled. "We want to call it Open Door Cafe, because we want everyone to know they're welcome." David nodded slowly, his throat tightening. "That's beautiful. Your Father in heaven would be proud." There was a pause. Then one of the young men said softly, "We learned everything from you." David shook his head gently. "No, you learned it from life. I just gave you a place to see what was already inside you." They all smiled quietly. A moment of understanding passing between them. Simple, genuine, and full of meaning. A few months later, David got another invitation, handwritten again, with a drawing of a small coffee cup on the corner. It was the grand opening of Open Door Cafe. The event was on a Saturday morning. David put on his best suit, the same one he had worn at his restaurant's 15th anniversary. He arrived early, and when he saw the cafe, he felt tears sting his eyes. It was perfect. Warm yellow light spilled out through the windows. The sign above the door was simple but elegant. Inside, the smell of fresh bread and coffee filled the air, and the walls were covered with pictures of people, families, friends, and right there on one of the walls was a framed photo, the same one from Harvest Table, of the three of them smiling together. David couldn't help but laugh softly. "You kept that old photo?" One of the young men grinned. "Of course. This place wouldn't exist without that day." The cafe filled quickly with people, students, neighbors, families. There was laughter, music, and a sense of togetherness that felt almost magical. When it was time for the ribbon cutting, they handed the scissors to David. "You should do it," one of them said. "You started it all." David chuckled, shaking his head. "No, you did. I just helped you find the spark, but they insisted." So, with a smile and a heart full of pride, David cut the ribbon. The crowd cheered. As people began to enter, the young men stood proudly behind the counter, greeting everyone with warmth. David stepped back for a moment, just watching. He saw in them everything he once dreamed of, not just success, but heart. And as the morning light streamed through the windows, David whispered to himself, "They did it. They really did it." In the weeks that followed, Open Door Cafe became a local favorite. People loved not just the food, but the atmosphere. Warm, kind, genuine. David visited often, sometimes helping in the kitchen, sometimes just sitting in a corner booth, sipping his coffee and watching quietly. He watched the way they treated every customer with care, the way they greeted everyone by name, the way they gave free meals to those who couldn't afford one. It reminded him of himself, years ago, and of the two boys who had once inspired him to be better. Sometimes, when the cafe was full, a few people would notice the older man sitting in the corner. They didn't always know who he was, but the owners always did. They'd bring him his coffee personally, and he'd smile and say, "You make a fine cup. Better than mine ever was." They'd laugh, knowing he didn't really mean it. One chilly evening after closing, David stayed behind to help clean up. The young men insisted he didn't have to, but he refused to leave. They worked side by side, wiping counters, stacking chairs, laughing about small things. At one point, David stopped and looked around the cafe. The warm lights, the hand-painted walls, the photo of them framed proudly near the door. He smiled quietly. "You know," he said, "this place feels like home." One of them looked up and said softly, "That's because it is." David's eyes softened. "I'm proud of you both. More than you'll ever know," they smiled back. "We're proud of you too. You changed everything." He shook his head gently. "No, you changed me. You reminded me that kindness doesn't fade with age. It only grows stronger when it's shared." They didn't speak after that. They didn't need to. The silence between them was full of peace. As the months rolled on, David continued visiting every few weeks. The cafe and the restaurant both thrived, sister stories born from one simple act of kindness. But one quiet morning, before the sun had even risen, David woke up feeling unusually tired. He sat by his window watching the soft light creep over the rooftops and thought about everything. His father, the restaurant, the boys, the laughter, the long years. He smiled to himself. What a beautiful journey it's been. That day he went to the cafe as he always did and sat in his favorite corner seat. The young men brought him his coffee, and they talked for a while, about life, about dreams, about how fast time was moving. Before leaving, David placed his hand on the table and said, "You know, this world can be tough sometimes, but if you keep choosing kindness, you'll always find your way." They nodded, their eyes soft. "We will, you taught us that." David smiled, stood up slowly, and said, "Good, then I've done my job." He left quietly, the little bell above the door jingling softly behind him. Weeks later, a letter arrived at Open Door Cafe. It was written in David's familiar handwriting. Inside, it said, "If you're reading this, I probably can't visit as much anymore, but don't be sad. Every moment we shared lives on in this place and in you. Keep feeding people's hearts as well as their stomachs. That's what makes life meaningful. With love, David." The two young men read the letter in silence, their eyes filled with emotion. They framed it and placed it on the cafe wall beside his photo. From that day forward, whenever new customers came in, they always asked about the letter. And the owners would smile and tell the story about a man who taught them that kindness could change the world, one meal at a time. Years later, the cafe grew into something even bigger, not in size but in reach. They started programs for underprivileged kids just like David once did. They offered cooking classes, mentorship, and small scholarships, And every time they welcomed a new student, they'd share the story of Harvest Table and the man who started it all. Kindness is like a recipe, they'd say. You pass it down one person at a time. People would listen, moved by the story. Some would even cry. But what mattered most was how it inspired others to open their doors, to help their neighbors, to see people for who they truly were. On the 10th anniversary of Open Door Cafe, the two young men stood together outside before opening. The morning sun was rising and the street was quiet. They looked up at the sign above the door, now slightly weathered but still shining proudly. One of them smiled. He'd be happy, wouldn't he? The other nodded. He is. I think he's watching, smiling right now. They unlocked the door, turned on the lights, and stepped inside. The smell of fresh bread filled the air, and the laughter of early customers soon followed. And on the wall, beside the framed letter, hung a new sign that read, "Kindness is the secret ingredient," because that's what David had taught them. That's what had changed everything. And as the day began, with sunlight pouring in through the windows and the sound of life filling the cafe, they knew his spirit would always live there, not in memory, but in action, in every smile, in every meal served with love. And so, the story continued, not as an ending, but as a promise, that one act of kindness could keep changing lives forever.